Virginia Woolf and the River, Tracing the Intersection of Eastern Philosophy and Western Modernisms in Mrs. Dalloway. I'm going to open up with a short piece of prose that I wrote while I was researching for this essay. Following footsteps left in ink, I walked through water, sweet plants, burnt sugar, through atoms, electrons, photons. Within a moment, I existed as both wave and particle, the wholeness of a second swelling deep, reaching back into every corner of time, to the river that floods in the night, the scent of evening flowers unfolding the moon under the black cottonwood that rests its spring leaves against the east, a freshness that is wholly unknown. In Mrs. Dalloway, Virginia Woolf's integration of each character's stream of consciousness fabricates a medium in which singular moments in the present time are experienced through the minds of multiple characters, while they simultaneously navigate past spans of time within their individual narrative consciousness. Her alteration of narrative perspective coincided with shifts in visual, philosophical, and scientific perspectives represented in art and literature of the same time period. Artists and writers began to focus on non-traditional forms, themes, and perspectives, more specifically an interest in identity, surrealism, discontinuity, and the discord of space and time began to develop. These interests were maturing in concurrence with increased global travel and intellectual exchange between Western and Eastern countries. In turn, Western theologians and philosophers began to show rising interest in Eastern philosophy, which can be noted when comparing the foundational beliefs of Buddhism to the scientific and philosophical theories that drove the modernist movement in the early 1920s. Through Woolf's unique style of narration, she integrates Eastern Buddhist philosophies that occur within each character's narrative consciousness, with Western scientific discoveries represented in the narrative form. Virginia Woolf, who was a self-proclaimed atheist, had predominantly negative feelings towards Eastern religious beliefs and was hesitant to engage with them in her writing or personal life. However, in spite of her resistance, Eastern philosophies were saturating Woolf's academic and artistic social circles. In her article Varieties of Mystical Experience in the Writings of Virginia Woolf, Julie Kane notes that the extent to which Eastern philosophy had permeated British consciousness in the years between the wars can be illustrated by the prevalence of belief in reincarnation. Three distinguished Cambridge philosophers, Goldsworthy Lowes Dickinson, J.M. McTaggart, and W. McNeill Dixon, were writing and lecturing under the banner of Cambridge reincarnationists. Additionally, Dixon and McTaggart were both part of the Bloomsbury group, in which Woolf and her husband Leonard were active. Independent of Woolf, other well-known writers were moved by Eastern philosophy. Woolf's close friend T.S. Eliot took interest in ancient Indian philosophy during his time at Harvard, studying Sanskrit, Pali, and Patanjali's metaphysics between 1906 and 1914, many of his poems showing clear evidence of Eastern beliefs, as Kane notes. The synthesis of Eastern principles is evident throughout the Western academic and artistic community. Woolf, being an integral part of both, was undoubtedly influenced by the beliefs of her friends, colleagues, and family. Arguably, the most significant Western scientific publication to come out of the early 1900s was Einstein's general theory of relativity. In short, this theory suggests that the fabric of space and time is constantly being fluxed and distorted by objects that contain mass. That time and space are malleable rather than concrete. From this theory, a multitude of Western philosophical and psychological theories were developed. Most importantly, a shifting concept of personal identity developing from how I perceive and influence reality became widely adopted by many modernist artists and writers who started to break with traditional Victorian values. Following the theory of relativity to show how different characters perceive reality is the pillar of Woolf's narrative form. Einstein's theory states that all objects with mass, including humans, distort the fabric of space and time toward the object. Woolf applies this principle to the use of multiple transitioning narratives, which create distinct frames of reference, phenomena perceived inwardly towards each individual character. Akin to Woolf's narrative form, Figure 1 demonstrates how Cubism visualizes shapes and surfaces of still objects from different perspectives, creating a multifaceted experience of a physical space or object. The flower shop scene at the beginning of Mrs. Dalloway offers a great example of how Woolf's narrative form functions within the text. During this scene, Woolf shifts between the consciousness of the protagonist, Clarissa Dalloway, Septimus Smith, a World War I veteran suffering from shell shock, and his wife, Lucrezia, who are all reacting to a loud noise coming from a passing car. In the shop, Clarissa is enjoying the sensory experience of the flowers and her liberation from the monstrous feelings of confinement to her domestic role. As if this beauty, this scent, this color, and Mrs. Pym liking her, trusting her, were a wave which she let flow over her and surmount that hatred, that monster, surmount it all, and it lifted her up and up, when oh, a pistol shot in the street outside. Then, the narrative quickly transitions to the post-traumatic visions of Septimus, who imagines himself as an obstacle in the world, which had come to a standstill. The throb of the motor engine sounded like a pulse, irregularly drumming through an entire body. It is I who am blocking the way, he thought. Was he not being looked at and pointed at? Was he not weighted there, rooted to the pavement for a purpose? Finally, the moment is narrated from Lucrezia's perspective, as she tries to deal with the suicidal ideations of her husband and the social stigma surrounding his illness, worried that people must notice, people must see. They were people now because Septimus had said, "I will kill myself." An awful thing to say. Suppose they had heard him. Help! Help! She wanted to cry out to the butcher's boy and the woman. The singular violent noise is no longer understood from the perspective of one person, but instead realized holistically through a narrative that uses alternating frames of reference. Furthermore, the book's plot structure or lack thereof complements how the reader interacts with the narrative form. Containing no resolution, rising action, or climax, the focal point becomes each reader's experiences rather than a traditional plot line. The reader, no longer adhering to a beginning, end, or middle, is instead placed in each narrative reality as it arrives in the book. Every instance perceived through the narrative consciousness of different characters. Since the perception of phenomena in Mrs. Dalloway is dependent on the frame of reference, the idea of existing in a concrete reality loses all foundation. While the theory of relativity is a powerful tool, it is only applicable to observations of physical phenomena. Lacking the qualities required to navigate emotion, memory, time, or thought, the narrative form becomes restricted to the three dimensions of space. However, following Buddhist principles, time is perceived as fluid, dissolving not only as a metaphysical or conceptual category, but also as a form of shorthand, which distinguishes between past, present, and future, as described by William Gallios in Zen History. Using this concept, Woolf navigates the narrative consciousness. Each character's internal thoughts and observations of sound, physical space, and outer phenomena are realized internally without temporal boundaries. As Clarissa's childhood friend Peter Walsh walks down the street feeling hollowed out from Clarissa's refusal of his love, he hears the bell of St. Margaret's as it glides into the recess of the heart and buries itself in ring after ring of sound. It is Clarissa herself, he thought, with a deep emotion and an extraordinarily clear, yet puzzling recollection of her, as if this bell had come into the room years ago, where they sat at some moment of great intimacy, and had gone from one to the other, and had left, like a bee with honey, laden with the moment. Within the narrative consciousness, time moves freely, where the brackish currents of the past and present flow into each other. The sound of St. Margaret's bell inherently represents the time of day within the plot. However, it also signifies a single phenomena observed in the narrative form. Then, as the moment transitions further into Peter's narrative consciousness, the bell becomes a memory, an emotion, a person, an experience that reflects his own reality. A majority of the story is told from the narrative consciousness, where Woolf is more capable of exploring the effects that identity, self, and no-self have on perception. Buddhist principles similarly focus on an individual self and no-self due to the belief that inherent existence is merely a conceptual designation or imputation. It never has and never will exist, as Victor Mansfield notes in his article about relativity in Buddhism and modern physics. A similar expression of existence as a state of mind is made during the dream sequence of Peter Walsh. By conviction of an atheist, perhaps, he is taken by surprise with moments of extraordinary exaltation. Nothing exists outside us except a state of mind, he thinks. In Buddhism, the concept of emptiness or void outside of the state of mind is often referred to as sunyata. This idea asserts that all things, including self, are empty, that all phenomena experienced in life lack inherent identity because everything is mutually dependent and interrelated, never wholly self-sufficient. Just as void and light in themselves are empty, a perfect oneness, the self neither acts on or is acted upon by outer phenomena, because the self and outer phenomena are of the same cloth. Often, the Western concept of emptiness implies that for something to be empty, it must contain nothing. However, it is important to understand that the Buddhist concept of emptiness, the concept that Woolf explores in Mrs. Dalloway, is that all things, including self, exist in oneness and therefore are empty. At the gates of St. Regent's Park, in the midst of frustration and anger following thoughts about Peter, their past relationship, and her choice not to marry him, Clarissa suddenly has a thought that breaks through her prior internal dialogue. In the moment, she knew nothing. No language, no history. She scarcely read a book now, and yet to her it was absolutely absorbing. All this, that somehow in the streets of London, on the ebb and flow of things, here, there, she survived. Peter survived. Lived in each other, being apart, and she was positive of the trees at home, of people she had never met, being laid out like mist between the people she knew best. In this short instance, the self is absent. Clarissa feels as if she is part of the city, the earth, of other people, of herself, of Peter, of the trees. Existing as everything and nothing, she experiences emptiness and oneness. More than any other character, Septimus demonstrates the concept of oneness through his narrative consciousness. In Regent's Park, he is transfixed by his senses, overwhelmed by the beauty of the elm trees rising and falling in the wind, forcing him to close his eyes. He would see no more, but they beckoned. Leaves were alive, trees were alive, and the leaves, being connected by millions of fibers within his own body, there on the seat, fanned it up and down. When the branch stretched, he too made that statement. Sounds made harmonies with premeditation. The spaces between them were as significant as the sounds. A child cried. Rightly far away a horn sounded. All taken together meant the birth of a new religion. Septimus, while considered mentally ill from shell shock, arguably undergoes a form of enlightenment concerning oneness of the universe and the self. In madness, he crosses some border, gaining the ability to not only perceive, but feel the circular behavior of time and interconnectivity of all things. Although it is perceived by other characters besides his wife as an act of cowardice, Septimus commits suicide as a final attempt to communicate oneness, to give an answer to the question of human nature and how there is no death, no birth, and no self, a statement that all things exist collectively, that death is simply a part of being, but does not signify the end or beginning. Adhering to Buddhist principles concerning existence and consciousness, much of Mrs. Dalloway concentrates on the exploration of the state of mind of individual characters, including those suffering from mental illness and suicidal tendencies. Similarly, with her coat pockets full of stones, Woolf committed suicide by walking into the river Ouse, to the place between channels where all moments touch, at the mouth of the ferry, in the mountains, through the sea. In her novel, Woolf descends beneath the shifting reality presented in the narrative form, past the surface and into the narrative consciousness of the characters. Within this space, she integrates foundational Buddhist beliefs concerning the concepts of time, space, self, and no-self, with Western scientific discoveries to comprehensively explore external and internal perceptions of reality.